of whom a grateful nation said, they were all we had. Who were they? This is their story.
In the fall of 1947, I was contacted by some people of the Jewish community. They told me that there were people from Palestine who later on turned out to be Haganah that were looking for someone, a Jew, an American Jew, who was involved in aviation.
There was no Israeli Air Force except the little Piper Cubs.
We were a total of, as I remember, 9 pilots in the whole Air Force, and maybe another half a dozen people on the ground. We used to carry the bombs on our laps in small aircraft like Oster, Tiger Moth, and that sort of thing. We used to carry them on our lap, and we used to throw them out of the window. I mean, that was our Air Force at the time.
I made contact with all of those people that I had known or did know in the aviation world that I thought could be useful.
The name Al Schwimmer came to my mind as a fellow who flew with me in TWA, a flight engineer, very competent. And the first word he mentioned is, how would you like to fly for Palestine?
I got the phone call from Schwimmer when he said, I understand you're looking for a flying job. I said, no, I'm not. He says, well, we have your papers that state that you are. I said, well, it depends on who I'm flying for.
We came to the conclusion that we would buy a fleet of transport aircraft.
It turned out that there were a lot of aircraft going surplus by the military, which you bought for very little above scrap value. Scrap was going about 3 cents a pound, aluminum, you name it, so this might have been going for 10 cents a pound. So we bought the aircraft at bid, sealed bid, 10 C-46s and 3 Constellations. The Constellations cost us $15,000 apiece, and the C-46s were $5,000 apiece.
How we recruited people, there was one instance where we stole the New York Air National Guard roster, and I was assigned to go down the list and find Jewish-sounding names.
We couldn't use high airline standards at that time. As long as a fellow can take off and land safely, it didn't have to be a polished airline type.
The base chaplain rabbi of the West Point was also the chaplain of the Veterans Hospital that my father was in. One day, he came to me and said, I've been collecting guns to send to Israel for the Haganah. Can you bring them down to New York?
We had an office at 250 West 57th Street called Service Airways.
I didn't know what it was. It was an outfit called Service Airways on the door.
Yehuda Razi came in one night.
There was a man there dressed in some sort of a oddball military uniform.
We assembled all of our pilots at the time and air crew, and as many as we had on the East Coast. And he drew the shades and he told us, gentlemen,
welcome to the Haganah.
The Haganah is the defense force of Israel.
That was my first indication or realization that, you know, this was an Israeli effort, and this was for real.
The program that was adopted by the headquarters of the Haganah and approved by Ben-Gurion and supported very much throughout the War of Independence consisted of 3 stages of operation. Total mobilization of everything we had in the country. The aircraft, the manpower, the few pilots we had. Second stage, which was to be performed in parallel with the first one, was to start purchasing all available aircraft, mostly war surplus, everywhere in the world, and see if we can devise ways by which they can be brought closer to the country. Number 3 was to start training Israelis, but we knew that time was not available anymore. Therefore, we had to mobilize volunteers abroad.
I liked to fly, of course, and this offered an opportunity to fly. I couldn't get a job with the airlines because I was a Jew. I don't care what anybody says. That was the way it was in 1947, 1946.
Young men who had fought in the American Air Force, Jews, were willing not only to go and collect money and send money to Israel, but to risk their lives. And some of them lost their lives in the process, as you very well know. They were an extraordinary crowd of people, there were a few Gentiles amongst them as well, who were moved by our effort to establish an independent Jewish state and who joined us in that effort.
You're not Jewish?
No, I'm
How come?
I'm Goy.
You are Goy. Tell us about it.
No,
Okay.
well,
That's very exceptional.
Yeah, well, actually, I'd seen Dachau, and I didn't like it.
Israel was the underdog, and I'm being an Irish background. We always, if it's an underground, and let's face it, we're trying to make up for some of the faults of the Christian world of what had happened before, because in 1945 I was at Bergen-Belsen.
Most of the guys had some little thing going for them. They were fed up with their job. They didn't have a job. They were fed up with their wives. They just left their wives. They just got thrown out. I think we're all a little sugar, you know.
We had recruited about 1,000 men, roughly 300 from Canada, about 700 from the States, and a handful from Latin America.
We had to evade the strict restriction against the exporting of heavy aircraft. It was against the law to ship anything to Israel, thanks to President Truman.
President Truman had declared an embargo on all arms, munitions of war, which included even a bolt for a wheel, or a tire, or a tube for a wheel of a Piper Cub, needed a Munitions Control Board export license. And that was effective April 13, 1948.
We were very much worried about the FBI. We changed our hotels every night. We phoned from space stations and not from a definite telephone. There was an embargo, and we shipped arms, and we sent people to fight in a foreign country. All this was against the laws.
The FBI and the Treasury Department were very much after us at this time. Everything we did, they always arrived, but they always arrived late, after.
To circumvent a United States embargo on the export of heavy aircraft, an agreement was concluded with the Panamanian government to create an international airline called Líneas Aéreas de Panamá. Overnight, Al Schwimmer's airplanes became the official certificated airline of Panama, LAPSA, which, in reality, was the embryonic Israeli Air Force.
The C-46s flew down to Mexico City. The Constellation flew nonstop to Panama. We lost one of the C-46s, as I've said before, in Mexico City.
Gershon was the only one we really lost in the operation there.
I was the first to take off. I think Ribikoff took off after me, and Bill Gerson was the third. Apparently, Gerson tried to stay in the air on one engine, and she flipped right over. And he and Wilson, his mechanic, got killed.
Gershon was recruited by Sam Lewis, myself. Sam Lewis knew him for some years. We just took him away. He left his field, left his wife, left his home. That was the infectious nature of the whole operation. People became enthused and committed by the very nature of seeing all these young people dedicated to the job they're doing.
The situation to get the airplanes out was very, very delicate, shall we say. And so what happened is we had these airplanes down in Panama, and these were the Panamanian airline run by the Arias family down there, and they couldn't understand why the hell weren't we had the airplanes, why weren't we flying places already, you know? Why were all these airplanes down there with all these guys and everything, with the mechanics?
We were getting close to the time in May when intelligence said that on the declaration of the independence of the State of Israel, Israel was to be invaded by armies on three sides.
The Arias family were very suspicious about it, so they put a military guard around the one Constellation.
One night we were called into a meeting, and I don't remember who it was, but this guy said, all right, all this crap is seized. We're going to Israel now.
We ran like thieves, and we jumped into the airplane, the Constellation, with our 14 mechanics, one with a wife, and we ground up this, and we took off, you know, without any permission whatsoever.
From Panama, 9 C-46s and 1 Constellation flew to Natal, Brazil, and then across the South Atlantic to Africa, to Italy, and then on to Czechoslovakia, where an understanding had been reached between the Israelis and the Czechs for the purchase of, irony of ironies, Messerschmitt fighters.
The Messerschmitts there were in various states of construction, parts, assembly, and so forth. So we had a base at Zatech, near Brno, north of Prague, where we then had a complete assembly, testing, and so forth. With the Russians, you know, watching, and with the Czechs cooperating, and with the cash payment in dollars.
In January 48, I was sent from Zagana to Czechoslovakia, to Žatec, to be the commander of the airport there, to absorb all the planes coming from United States, and to organize the field, to send the rifles and the spare parts and the planes to Israel.
From the Czech base, codenamed Zebra, they dismantled the Messerschmitts and loaded them aboard their transports, along with guns and ammunition, and flew this desperately needed cargo across the Mediterranean to Israel.
The famous Biza machine gun, which was one of the important elements that helped to break the blockade of Jerusalem, which was a Czech machine gun, was brought to Israel by the Constellation.
These crates of Biza machine guns and ammunition, which to this day I feel is so timely that without those Bizas, the war might have turned out to be a little bit differently.
Landed there in Ekron, or Akira as we used to call it, getting there about 2 o'clock in the morning, the fantastic greeting there by the guys there, the people there. They all came down to the airplane with their trucks.
They all helped unload the Biza machine guns. The hunger, the excitement, machine guns with ammunition.
It was really a glorious moment because we really weren't there very long, I think about 2 hours. And in 2 hours we refueled and we had to leave again.
The next morning I heard we had the great battle. The machine guns turned the enemy away.
Without the aircraft there, God knows how that country would have survived today. Because this is the aircraft that brought the guns in. Lots of guns, lots of Czech guns, lots of ammo.
The Messerschmitts, assigned to the 101 Squadron, aptly named since it was Israel's one and only fighter squadron, arrived in the nick of time. On their very first mission, May 29th, 1948, 4 Messerschmitts, now with the Star of David on their wings, attacked and repulsed an Egyptian armored column less than 30 miles north of Tel Aviv.
It was the culmination of all our dreams to finally fly, so to speak, under our own flag with the Magen David on the wings. In a few minutes, we were over Ashdod, and I looked down, and wherever I looked, there were the soldiers, the Egyptian soldiers. There must have been 800 vehicles and maybe 10,000 troops, like ants all over. And I pushed the nose down, and I was right over the square, which was filled with soldiers, and we attacked. At the moment that we attacked, the whole place erupted with anti-aircraft fire. I guess everybody there, all 10,000 of them, were shooting at us with whatever they had. It was a great sensation. We were finally hitting back. I was not aware at the time that Eddie Cohn was hit and crashed. That evening, our people intercepted a radio message from the commander of the Egyptian forces. And I'll never forget it. It said, we were heavily attacked by enemy aircraft and we were scattering. And they never moved 1 inch forward.
My first arrival in Israel, I crashed. Well, when we arrived over Israel, it was completely socked in, fogged in. So I called the crew in the cockpit. There were 4 of us, and I said, well, these are our options. We're all in this together. What do we do? Take a shot at it. Try to make the landing. So I made 6 passes. And I kept on getting lower, and I finally hit the ground. And the navigator, who was a kid from the Bronx, Mo Rosenbaum, I had instructed the crew to stay in the cockpit. And he got so scared watching these approaches that he left the cockpit to sit in the cabin. And of course, when we hit, the cargo shifted, moved forward, and crushed him. I was knocked stunned in the crash, and the first thing I remember was my co-pilot shaking me. He said, come on, get out, we're on fire. And I went to bail out of the side window, and I couldn't move, and I figured, holy mackerel, my back is broken. What it was, I'd forgotten to untie my safety belt, you know. So I untied the safety belt, jumped out, helped my co-pilot out. And of course, everything was burning, you know, and it was foggy, and everything was illuminated only by the light of the fire. And I said, come on, let's get the hell out of here. This thing is going to blow up, because we had bombs and stuff. And we started to walk away from the plane, and we heard this moaning from the aircraft. And so the co-pilot said, come on, we got to go back. Eddie is still in there. That was our radio operator. So I went back to the window. He said, I can't move, you know, I have a broken leg. And I said, well, I'm not coming in there after you. You better get over here. So he crawled over to the window. And Eddie Stirak, who was not Jewish, by the way, he's Polish, he crawled over the window, and he's about 6'4", and he weighed about 250 pounds. And I picked him up like a baby and, you know, dragged him through this window. And I said to Eddie, I've got to put you down. I can't carry anymore. I carried him about a mile. And he said, don't leave me here. The Arabs will get me. They'll cut my nuts off. I said, just lay down there and keep quiet. And we walked right into the field. And I had a broken nose and a bunch of bones in my face, broken, and burnt arms, burnt face, burnt hair. But I was alive. And it was very funny. I says, well, I remember saying to myself, by God, I got away with this one. I'm never going to get in a plane again. About a week later, I was back flying again.
The C-46, originally designed to ferry supplies over the hump to China in World War II, was never intended to function as a bomber. But it did, and well.
C-46s, night after night after night, dropping bombs with bomb chuckers. These were young cadets who had the job of taking the wheelbarrow to the edge. When they saw the green light, they threw out the bombs.
The bomb chuckers were a wonderful bunch of guys. They were all volunteers. They had no experience in doing a thing like this. And also, you had a guy who was in the door of the aircraft there, and he had his back to the wind, but he had like a window washer's what do you call it? Harness on there, and he had his legs spread apart, and they took the bombs, and he pushed them between his legs, and he had to pull these two tags. I'd like to see you do that thing when the airplane is going pitching back and forth, trying to evade, you know, the lights and trying to evade whatever anti-aircraft.
One Chochem, one of the young kids, didn't like leaning out in the wind blast at 150 miles an hour and pulling the pins out. He decided to pull the pins out while the bombs were in the airplane. And while rolling to the edge, one bomb rolled off and started to roll to the back of the airplane. It hit sideways with an active pin, not safetied. So you can imagine, had that not hit sideways, I wouldn't be here to tell the tale. Simultaneously, while we're engaged in using live bombs to create havoc and to be more effective, we had cases and cases of pop bottles, beer bottles, that we'd also throw out by the case. And the theory was that at terminal velocity from 10,000 feet, these beer bottles made so much noise, the whistle sound, and then the crash, that the civil population would panic and get on the roads and hinder the progress of the Egyptian army. The effect was devastating.
As they said in those days, a hell of a way to fight a war. But it did the job. It held the line until the real bombers could be obtained. B-17s, 4 of them, purchased war surplus by Al Schwimmer. 3 of the bombers reached the Czech base at Zebra and then continued on to Israel. Eli Cohen, a navigator, will never forget his first flight in one of the B-17s. 15,000 feet over the Atlantic, stepping over a plexiglass floor window, he fell through the floor.
I was out of the airplane from just below my shoulders. The only part of me that was in the airplane was my head and the very top of my shoulders. In falling through, I had also rubbed myself along the crazed glass, and I was having internal bleeding. The pilot and the crew co-pilot were back here. The radio men were back here, and the rest of the crew were back in here. When I began yelling, and when this tremendous high whistle of the rush of the wind coming through the cracked plexiglass was there, nobody heard us.
And it took a number of minutes before he was rescued. And he was hanging out over the middle Atlantic Ocean.
I am the only one that I know who has ever survived this type of a thing.
The fourth B-17, flown by veteran Captain Irvin Schindler, got no further than the Azores.
They had seized the crew and held them under arrest at the airport. The aircraft was seized. Subsequently, the crew went back to stand trial in New York. Schindler was very lucky. There was a nice judge who gave him a suspended sentence, a little probation, and that was the end of it. The rest were let off because they were unknowing, volunteers. But the airplane was lost.
The three B-17s that did reach Israel, however, made their presence known to the enemy from the very start. Being ferried in from Czechoslovakia, one bombed Cairo. The other two hit Gaza and El Arish. From that day on, no Egyptian bomber ever again appeared over an Israeli city.
We took off on the morning of July the 15th, three B-17s. One B-17 was to go to over and bomb Cairo. I was on that airplane. And the other two were scheduled to go to El Arish.
When we got to El Arish, it was dusk. We could see the airfield, but not well enough, not clearly enough, so it was decided not to bomb them. I said, there's Gaza. So we bombed it.
The raid was organized so that the other two of us would bomb El Arish or Gaza as a diversionary flight about 5 minutes before the high-altitude B-17 bombed Cairo.
And then we came up 25,000 feet and we were coming over Cairo. And at our altitude, it was just dusk. And we could see all the lights. Cairo was lit up brilliantly. Our aiming point was King Farouk's palace. 4 bombs fell in front and 8 bombs fell behind it. The first squadron commander was Ray Kurtz.
Ray couldn't stand cold water. If you took him in a swimming pool, it had to be lukewarm. As it turned out later, after the War of Independence, Ray Kurtz met an icy, watery grave off of Greenland, completely disappeared.
One of the raids that I remember, our plane was finished being refueled and bombed, and we had no place to go. And I said, well, gee, we got this plane, what are we going to do? And one of the crew members said, hell, he says, let's bomb Damascus. I said, hey, that's a good idea. We took off unescorted, flew at altitude 10 or 15,000 feet, I don't recall, bombed the airport at Damascus, and then we could see the explosions. I don't know how much damage we did because we had mostly Second World War leftovers from the Luftwaffe. And then we came back on the deck. And on the way back, we came across this big supply column that was headed into Israel. And I know that we tore up and down with all the gunners shooting at whatever they could see on the ground. And later on, we were told that we had broken up a big invasion force of Syrians. The thing that impressed me most about the whole thing is it was rather informal, There was really no, you wanted to go bomb, so you went to bomb.
Hank Greenspun, who was a World War II U.S. Army major, landed on the Normandy beach. In 1948, was drafted by Al Schwimmer into the Haganah. Sent to Hawaii to inspect war surplus aircraft parts, he found a treasure trove of machine guns and aircraft engines. In crates labeled agricultural implements, he smuggled this vital cargo from Hawaii to Mexico, where he obtained an additional supply of guns and ammunition. There, in Mexico, he succeeded in loading this entire cargo aboard a freighter.
All of a sudden, the phone rings. It's Teddy Kolick and Eliyahu Sakharov on the other phone. They're calling from New York. I says, Teddy, the ship has gone. I says, I forgot to call you. We had a code name. As soon as the ship, because every day they call, BG says, this ship must come. Ben Gurion. I says, the ship is gone. It sailed at sunset this morning. Teddy says, Hank, you can't imagine how important this ship is. It must go. I says, the ship is gone. It's gone, Teddy. And they both started to cry, and I started to cry at the other end. The three of us are crying on the telephone. He says, you're positive? I says, Teddy, the ship is gone. Notify them. Notify BG that the ship is gone.
But believe me, if you wrote a scenario for a picture, you couldn't do it better. We were out of fuel for that evening's flight, and a little chap, Peter Barr, was then in supply service for the Ministry of Defense, who himself went to Haifa to meet the boat from Veracruz, to unload the first drums of fuel onto certain trucks, to take them ahead of the unloading to Ekron to fuel that night's flights. Otherwise, we were grounded. No bombing, no airlift.
And it brought all the spare engines and spare parts and whatnot that were needed to operate the C-46s. And the ship brought about 2,000 tons of aircraft bombs and ammunition and whatnot.
They took everything off this ship that could move, that could fly, and they put it on anything. And they swept into the Negev.
The Negev, the arid, inhospitable desert in southern Israel that encompassed nearly 3/4 of the territory allocated to the new state, the very heart of the nation. In September 1948, the Egyptian army pushing into the Negev threatened to overwhelm a besieged Palmach brigade and thereby split the entire country in two. The Air Transport Unit was asked to prepare a plan to airlift supplies and soldiers. It was impossible, impractical, and unthinkable, and therefore could be done. And it was.
In a period of about 2 months, transported up to 100 tons a night. We changed 5,000 men in the Army.
Some of them have never been in an airplane in their life before, except seeing one. Now you're flying them down in the Negev and leaving them down in the enemy country, you know, cut off by Majdal and Fallujah down there, their first time in combat, or going to face combat, and you're bringing back these young kids, these Palmachniks, full of life and enthusiasm. They were boys and girls. You couldn't tell a difference. They were kids.
We were taking wounded back to Tel Aviv, and they were all refugees who had come off the Cyprus and so forth, all spoke Yiddish. There was one young man who we had on a stretcher. In order to get him onto the C-46, he had to be lifted onto a jeep and so forth, which moved him quite a bit and was painful for the wounded. And I heard him sobbing, and I went over to him. I said, "Don't worry, it'll just take a few minutes, and we'll have you on the plane. You'll half hour, you'll be in Tel Aviv. The doctors will take care of everything." He said, "Don't think I'm not crying because of my pain. I have lots of pain." He said, "But that's not why I'm crying." He says, "It wasn't so long ago I didn't know if I would survive day to day. I didn't know if I'd be alive." He said, "And to think that I would have the opportunity to fight for Medinat Yisrael, that I could fight for Israel, and if I were wounded, I would be flying out of here in a Jewish plane with Jewish pilots." He says, "I'm crying because I survived and because Israel survives."
The war raged on. Slowly, ever so slowly, the enemy was pushed back, helped no little by the replacement of the dangerously unreliable Messerschmitts with the acquisition of new, far more efficient fighter planes.
The Messerschmitt was our first fighter aeroplane. We had a lot of problems with the Messerschmitt because of the landing gear and because of the engines, and many of those airplanes were damaged and broken just in normal flying. Luckily for us, we managed to buy Spitfires.
Spitfires, sold to Israel by the Czechs and flown to Israel via Yugoslavia in another impossible operation, Velveeta.
I was asked to plan Velveeta, the flying of the Spitfires from Yugoslavia to Israel.
So we decided to take 6 of those planes, take out the radios, take out everything, strip it completely bare, if you remember, put gas tanks, it was literally a flying bomb, and try to get 6 over land, past Turkey, past Greece, hopefully get through and make a landing.
Sam Pomeranz made a new design and installed extra wing tanks and extra tanks by replacing the radio.
We had replaced the pilot seats with rubber fuel tanks that Sam Pomeranz had set up and designed, because these airplanes, these Spitfires, were going to go nonstop to Israel. Never done in history. And we did that, we took off, and we would, on the DC-4, were flying just as fast as we possibly could in safety, and the Spitfires were flying alongside of us just as slow as they could.
We were their navigators, and they sat behind us, throttled back, so that they wouldn't wind up over Egypt.
When we left Czechoslovakia, we had Yugoslavian colors on the plane. And then we got the Yugo, we washed them off and put the Israeli. The word was if we were knocked down or we were forced down, they ask you who we are. We're Yugoslavians, right?
Right.
He lands in Yugoslavia. The farmers take him. They want to kill him. They put him in the jail. And when the policemen come and they interview him, they say, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm a Yugoslavian." He says, "Talk Yugoslavian." I can't.
The day we landed, 22nd December 1948, the next day, Spitfires, the same Spitfires, took part in the big kick of the Egyptians out of the Sinai. And that was a big contribution to the success and to the end of the war.
Sidney Cohen, South Africa. He was our commanding officer after Muddy Alone died. Sid Cohen, being the natural leader that he was, he became it.
Rudy, one of the stars of the squadron. I have 4 confirmed kills. I shot down 2 Spitfires, 1 Fiat, and 1 Dakota. All the planes were Egyptians.
5 British aircraft were shot down that day. We don't know exactly who shot which ones down, but definitely 5.
When they shot down the 5 aircraft that day, he was one of the 4. And they came down, a guy named Sudden Death Schroeder flew 1 mission, shot down 1 airplane, and went home. He got the name Sudden Death Schroeder. Yeah. In that flight was another guy, Arnie Rook from South Africa, tremendous sense of humor. So when they talked to Sudden Death, they asked him, "I shot down 1 aircraft. I think Asa was in the flight too. What happened to you? I think I damaged 1. Came to the other guy, I forgot. But when it came to Arnie Rook, they said, "Arnie, what did you get?" He says, "I got an awful fright." An awful fright.
In the late fall of 1948, through the efforts and sacrifices of all involved, Israelis and foreigners, Jews and Gentiles, the war was nearing a successful conclusion.
The contribution of the Mahal pilots who came to Israel to fight with us, and they helped us very much. In fact, they were the only pilots, except for 2 or 3 Israeli pilots, like Ezer Weizmann and Modi Alon, that joined the squadron. They came from the United States, from South Africa, from England, from Canada, and their help was very, very essential. And I would say that without them, probably our situation in the war would have been very, very difficult.
The beginning of the War of Independence, the Egyptian Air Force controlled the skies. When they came, the tide was turned in our favor. Therefore, I believe that first and foremost, it was a significant military contribution to the fighting of Israel at the War of Independence, that was the longest and the most painful war that we have ever experienced.
But for some volunteers, it was not quite over. A number of them, returning home to America, were accused of a variety of Neutrality Act violations, indicted and put on trial.
There were 22 or 23 of us that were charged in the federal court with illegal export and breaking the U.S. illegal export to the Middle East and breaking the U.S. Neutrality Act.
This is the first time in the history of the United States which had a neutrality law for 200 years. It's the first time they ever brought anybody to trial.
There was a bitterness, sort of an act of vengeance against most of us. I don't think the trial was necessary. I believe we weren't really guilty of any harm to the United States. All we did, we took airplanes out of this country that the United States was selling for junk. They didn't want them. And for this, they prosecuted us and persecuted us for 9 months.
Of those brought to trial, the only criminal to serve a jail sentence was ironically a Gentile, Charles Winters. Years later, his deathbed request to be buried in Israel was granted. And there was yet another righteous Gentile, fighter pilot Wayne Peake, who asked to be, and indeed was, buried in Israel. So, after nearly 40 years, the contribution of these foreign volunteers was finally recognized.
I believe that Israel is very thankful to them for what they have done, for what they showed by their volunteering.
Israel never owed me anything, but I owe Israel a debt of gratitude, and that what we did with love, and that we owe.
Since Israel was created, since it became a state, we all walk with our heads high.
The commander of today's Israeli Air Force honored some of the surviving pilots.
And to all the volunteers, I would like to present a memento to mark the contribution of each and every one back in '48.
We don't need overseas pilots. We don't even need Jewish pilots. What we need is Israeli pilots. And it was on this base that we got the first 4 pilots who got their wings, and I was very happy to play a part in it.
It's been my privilege, what can I tell you? It caught me just right. I was in the right place at the right time with the right background, and it was a privilege, and I'm really most thankful.
If it weren't mainly for the expertise from the American Machal boys, Israel may not have been realized.
We had to go over there and do something because of what had happened in World War II.
I just couldn't understand how the Jew was so mistreated. And so many millions of people were killed. I had to do something, and this was my opportunity to help do something. And I was just a small cog because there's so many other guys did their thing, but did it the hard way and never came back, you know. So whatever I did was for the sake of a nation, and I would do it over again.
It was one of the finer parts of my life.
לא, גברתי.